Hello, Professor Warden. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Happy to be here, Tom.
Yeah, now we had a schedule. I was trying to get this meeting for a while, and let me get this. Trying to get everybody to be able to make it. So we decided on the 9th. Well, what we forgot was there's a violence task force meeting on the 9th at 5:30 that I'm supposed to be on, but I already told them I couldn't make it. And then we have a CPRB meeting at 6. So I don't think Matt, he'll probably go to that. So I'm not sure. But we're going to have people here. We appreciate you being here. Brendan Cox said that he would try to make it. He's going to move some things around. So, and I see Stephen Holt is here. Thank you, Professor Holt. So let me start the meeting off officially. Good evening, everybody. This is the public safety meeting of the Common Council of Albany. And joining us tonight are committee members Jack Flynn and other council members Jenny Farrell and Megan Keegan. Guests tonight are going to be Robert Worden, professor at UAlbany, and Stephen Holt, also professor at UAlbany. And let me see if there's anybody else. And we're also joined by committee member Sonia Frederick. Thank you, Sonia, for being able to make it because we had the other meeting, as you know.
Yeah, I'm sort of going to be in and out by 2. I think Kelly's going to do the same approach.
Yes. And I woke up this morning, you probably saw my text at like 5:45, and I realized that we had 2 meetings scheduled. And we also have the CPRB scheduled for today at 6. So it's like, it's a full, today's a popular day, June 9th, for whatever reason. It should have been June 6th. We could say it's D-Day, but So the idea of this is I went to there was a policing crisis conference at UAlbany put on, I believe it was Rockefeller College, and I saw Professor Warden, I saw Stephen Holt, Matt Ingram had told me about it when he came up for reappointment for the CPRB. And I attended both days, and I was hoping to get some answers because we're working on 2 local laws, Local Law C and Local Law F, about community policing and trying to reimagine how we can do things. And I went in thinking, I'm going to get some answers here. And there's more questions than answers. And, that's why I thought, we need more discussion about these 2 local laws. They're really, at one point, we thought we'd had to have them on the ballot by August. And now the thinking is that we don't have to have it on the ballot, that it fits into the framework, or even if it doesn't, and we do have to do the ballot, we'll wait another year. We want to do this right. We don't just play around and make changes and then, mess things up, worse than possible. One of the other things that came out of this conference was that I'd like to work with the school, with Rockefeller College and the other departments to be able to, whatever changes we make, be able to have those changes studied and see if indeed we made a difference or not, and get the academic side for it. And I forgot to mention is JR. We also have our legislative advisor, John Raphael Picardo, visiting us, and we also have Ava Ayers. So thank you both for coming. I'm sorry I didn't see you right away. So that's where we're at. I didn't have anything planned. I'm just wondering, Robert and Steve, did you get the language for local law C or F, and did you have a chance to look at it? Okay, I see you both nodding, so that's good. So I guess I could start there. Robert, I'll start with you. What do you think? Do you think reading that, are we in the right direction?
Well, Tom, I won't claim to have studied it. I read it in a rather cursory fashion, honestly, but I was struck by some contrast with what I know of social science research anyway. Dating back to the 1960s. And I'll try to be coherent, although I won't claim to have given this a lot of thought at this point. I'd say that It's important to understand that the police role is not confined to or even primarily about crime control and law enforcement. That social science has recognized this for decades. I'm not sure popular culture ever caught up with that. But society, as I imagine all or most of you appreciate, calls on the police to handle a broad range of situations. They have one common feature, that their immediate resolution might, with an emphasis on the might, require legal or physical force. The solutions that police provide are provisional and short-term by their nature, and they leave to other agencies or parties the implementation of longer-term solutions. Research shows, by the way, that typically police are able to resolve situations without resorting to formal legal action or any physical force, though their authority might be an important factor in gaining compliance. Now, one scholar recently observed, and he said it more elegantly and with greater elaboration than I can and will tonight. He said, quote, "Police are a residual institution charged with managing the crises that other institutions cannot handle adequately on their own. And it is not easy to reassign that work to anyone else." And I think he's right. And shifting responsibility for some such problems to personnel who lack police authority likely has some unforeseeable consequences and should be approached with due caution. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying it's daunting and fraught. Information on calls for service is often fragmentary, especially given the circumstances under which people are calling the police for assistance. It's not infrequently erroneous, leaving a lot of room for errors in determining what kind of personnel to dispatch. And if only one or the other is dispatched, then logically errors can take one of two forms: either over-responding with a sworn officer whose authority is unnecessary for that situation, or under-responding with non-sworn personnel who lack the authority to safely resolve the problem. Now, notwithstanding the supporting memorandum that I saw, the base of empirical research, distinct from non-scientific advocacy, on which prescriptions for alternative responses rest, is neither large nor consistent. I know of no one who has documented and evaluated any experience with the kind of authority whose creation you're contemplating. So I can't speak on the basis of empirical evidence about an experience in another jurisdiction that's done what you're contemplating doing. If there's research on that, I haven't seen. But I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And we are joined by committee member Kelly Kimbrough. Thank you, Kelly. Steve, can I ask you what your thoughts are?
Yeah, so I think Robert put a lot of the kind of context around policing quite well, which is, I think, the kind of broader administrative problem that we face with policing, and that's not just here, but just in general, more broadly, is that they're just asked to respond to so many varied circumstances and situations, some of which exceeds the scope of their training, but even just kind of the scope of any one unit of government to be able to manage effectively. Now, I will say that to update at least a little bit the empirical research, there was a randomized control trial that came out of the STAR program in Denver, which is Support Team Assistance Response, and it was just published today, or like yesterday, in Science. So very new, hot off the presses. But the way they approach this is somewhat similar here to what the sense that I got of reviewing what the proposal here. And what they did was they essentially paired a mental health and medical first responder together in rapid response units to respond to non-violent situations, calls for service. And they were the first responders for a lot of non-violent situations, and then would escalate it to police as needed, or connect people in need of assistance with appropriate assistance, social services, mental health services, medical services, what have you. All of which is to say, they found pretty substantial decreases in violent crimes and pretty substantial increases in uptakes of appropriate services. Now, this is a pilot program, of course, caveats apply, but it was a pretty rigorous, well-designed study done by people I happen to know and trust. And so I will just add that there's at least some growing evidence. And I will say, Tom, to what you put out at the beginning, I think a good approach is to think about designing an early implementation of this in a way that would allow for at least some study, like early on, onboarding early on, to collect data so that we can at least make sure that if there are errors, we know what the errors were. But to your broader ask about the proposal on the table, now, like Robert, I gave it a cursory read, but I thought the proposal structures things well, creating kind of the Department of Public Safety, enabling them to create an administrative body that's going to be managing a non-police response service, I think is smart. So yeah, I'll shut up there. I've kind of talked for a while.
Well, one question I have on that pilot study is who decided what was like violent or, was that the 911 callers? Were they trained?
Right. So it would go to a dispatcher, and the dispatcher would in the treatment district, the dispatcher would make that call and send the STAR response team based on the call itself, whatever the scenario was reported to the dispatcher. And
I'm going to, Ava, would you mind stepping up? Professor Ayers is from the Albany Law School and helped us come up with Local Law C. And I don't know if you worked on Local Law F, Ava. I think we just pulled it out. So probably your fingerprints are there a little bit. And I'm just curious about, what your thoughts are.
Sure, thank you, and thanks to the council. So, unlike the professors who just spoke, I'm not an empirical researcher, so I don't speak authority on those statistics. I did know about the Denver study, so I'm glad Professor Holt mentioned that, because I thought that was, I saw that come up in my feeds yesterday, and I'm glad that somebody who actually is capable of assessing it is here to help us talk that through. What I will say is that, so I did work on the drafting for C and F. I think that F currently sort of pulls out some aspects of the Department of Armed First Responders. I think it probably needs to do more if that's the direction the council wants to go in. And what I'll just say is that, I think that, again, as somebody who's not an empirical researcher and who doesn't have a background in assessing this, what I understood from the folks involved in the collaborative was that the very strongest public message coming from folks who spoke to the city government after the George Floyd killing was, we want unarmed responders. That of all the things we heard, that was what I heard at the street protests. It was what I heard in the collaborative. And when I worked on drafting this, what I was trying to do was create a system where it's not an all or nothing, take entire categories and just completely separate police from that process, right? I think everybody who was involved in I shouldn't say everybody, I shouldn't speak for anybody but myself, but a lot of people recognize, there are going to be situations, and all of the programs that I'm familiar with involve the ability to bring in police, either as co-responders to certain kinds of calls, or on some sort of a triage basis, or as summoned. It could be even, I think a lot of fire department response involves police initially responding to the scene and then assessing the scene and leaving if there's not a necessity for police response. So there's a wide variety of ways that could be done depending on what kind of incident. And Local Law C was designed to list a variety of incidents where experts or activists or mouthy people of whatever nature have suggested maybe this would be an opportunity to reduce police interaction, because what we unambiguously know is that there are a lot of interactions between police and turn violent. And so, the danger involved in traffic stops, for example, is something that's one of the kinds of things that's on the list. I'm familiar with one study that says it's approximately 1 in 6.5 million stops that ends with the killing of a police officer, 1 in 361,000 that involves injury to an officer. Now, if you repeat a lot of stops over a period of time, that may add up to a significant risk and be something that you want to manage. But is that for all traffic stops? Are there traffic stops that could be handled by traffic cameras so that there, in fact, is no need for a stop? I don't think that, certainly not my sense that I was prepared to draft something that would answer those questions, that would divide those different responsibilities. I think there probably are some categories of police civilian interaction where an unarmed response be possible. For example, I just have a real heart, which is the number one thing people call the Albany Police Department for, according to the statistics the collaborative saw. Personally, anybody needs to have a gun when a citizen comes to the police department to take a report, but also that's not a category. A lot of violent eruptions. Not that really solves any problem by shifting that out. So my overall thought was, the most important question for the council was, if the council's doing what I think the council is doing, that is separating the police commission proposal from the Department of Unarmed First Responders proposal and carrying those things separately, then the question is, who's going to decide what this Department of Unarmed Responders would do, right? Where does that authority come from? And I have to defer to those who know city government better than me, because I don't detect an obvious player on the scene. The council could hold a series of hearings, case by case, for as long as you all want to, and that'd certainly be a fine way of doing it. But again, I do think that to not create some sort of a Department of Unarmed Responders would be a huge dismissal of the single most commonly demanded thing we saw in the collaborative, and certainly the way most jurisdictions have approached is in terms of pilot programs to experiment, to gather data, to move somewhat cautiously. So I think there are lots of ways, and I'm thrilled that we have people here tonight about the details of those pilot programs. I do. What I want to say is, just because I think my expertise, to the extent I have any, is really on legislative drafting, and what I've offered to the council as in the past is not so much a substantive expert as somebody who can help you all draft whatever you think is best, to the extent that the draft of local law F doesn't really, it has more of the oversight stuff than it does of the unarmed responder stuff in it. And so to the extent the council wants to move forward, I think there's something to there. But again, thank you for inviting me to share thoughts.
Yeah, now, and I just want to bring up, Robert, when I was at the policing crisis conference, one of the things, and I asked a question during when you were on one of the panels, and you pretty much shocked me that people impressions won't change. That, if they're nervous about police, no matter what we do, they're still it's gonna be hard to sway them. I just want to make sure I got that right. Is that, do you remember that, or?
Oh yeah, I do, Tom. And I wouldn't say that people's attitudes will never change. I would say that the research shows pretty clearly, at least with respect to police, and I think probably more generally, that they are resistant to change. That people tend to interpret events in terms of their pre-existing worldviews, and to emphasize the features of those events that are consistent with what they thought in the first place, and to maybe selectively attend to facts or interpretations of ambiguous circumstances that are consistent with their pre-existing outlooks.
Well, I'm going to open it up to the group here, to the council, to the committee members, and I see Jack has his hand up. So go ahead, Jack. Thanks.
Thank you all. Well, I attended SUNY Albany back in the late 90s, and Professor Acker was my mentor when I was there. I'm sure you all know him.
Yes.
But can I get both your opinion on your definition of community policing? Because it's a very broad, and we all like to talk about it in the political world. So could you give me your actual definition of what you would determine as community policing?
Well, I guess it's my definition, but I certainly didn't originate it. I've adopted it from people who have studied it even longer than I have. That it involves the police taking cues from the community about their priorities, and especially about partnering with community organizations to address public safety problems. And those are problems writ large. They might be crime problems. They might be problems of social or physical disorder, but it's extending beyond what's sometimes called an incident-driven response, responding to individual situations and analyzing the conditions that underlie those incidents to try to address the more collective problem that they together represent. And a lot of jurisdictions have had some success in that. Albany has occasionally practiced problem-oriented policing, but I think there's probably a lot of room for improvement in their practice of that. And I think that's just a key element of community policing, applying that approach to the public safety problems that are priorities for Albany's neighborhoods.
Yeah, I would just add, I always think about how to define these things in terms of how they're implemented and how we think about implementing them on the ground. And so one of the things that struck me, it was like, I don't know, 5-6 years ago that I was looking into a lot of the community policing literature to get a handle on what evidence we have, what that evidence is based on, how police departments tend to implement this stuff. And as you kind of flagged, there's a variety of definitions. But one of the ways that I think captures what Robert was describing as the broad goal of having ties to the community is having more frequent stable assigned beats. So a lot of times police departments vary the beats, the officers that are on different beats over time. And so it becomes very hard to know your neighborhood police officer because it's just some random person that happened to have a shift. So having stably assigned beats tends to build better community relations. Having liaisons that are assigned to different districts or wards that are responsible for maintaining a police relationship with different community organizations. Those are the kinds of things that at an implementation level actually defines community-based policing. Now, a lot of departments will have 1 or 2 officers that they put through a 6-hour training, and that they will also talk about doing community-based policing. But I think without these other elements that are measurable, implementable steps that capture, yes, we are making an effort to develop ties to the community, I think some of it is a little misleading.
So my next question follow-up is, they started doing studies in the 90s about community policing. Do you think we're going in the right direction, or do you feel that police departments need to change a new theory, a new philosophy? Or is there data that's saying we are going in the right direction and that's what we need, or we need something different? I guess that's my question. And I know we all talk about it, but is it really what departments should be focusing on?
I'll let Robert take the first stab at that.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Well, I think there isn't a consensus in many quarters of science, but I think a lot of police researchers would say that community policing is at its best a strategic innovation. It involves changes in the mission and the organization and management of a police department. I know of very few documented instances in which a police department has actually adopted community policing as a genuinely strategic innovation. Most departments adopt it in a more programmatic form, kind of an add-on, like we have a community policing unit, And so it doesn't achieve what it potentially could. You might laugh, but one of the best examples of community policing implementation was in the city of Chicago, of all places. I know, hard to believe, but between the early to mid 90s and the early aughts or so, Chicago's alternative policing strategy was pretty robust implementation of community policing. And it was incidentally a mayoral initiative and not just a police department initiative that was probably key to the success they enjoyed for a while. But even where it's been implemented in a more shallow form, it has been successful, at least in improving levels of public trust, which, by the way, Tom, would be in contradiction to my more general observation about how resistant people's attitudes are to change. I mean, Chicago certainly saw a change over time, and particularly in African-American neighborhoods, in the level of trust and regard that people had for the police. And I think that was owing to the fact that police made some measurable progress in addressing the problems that were priorities for people in those neighborhoods. I'm not sure that was an answer to your question, Councilmember Flynn, but that's what I got.
No, it did. It shines some light. And you answered my next question about it. Were there any municipalities that have data to prove that theory? Thank you.
Sure.
I just want to jump in. And just to tell everybody, some people know already, the Violence Prevention Task Force, which is also meeting at the same time right now, we decided to have like a listening session at the high school. And we had between 25 and 30 students come to a roundtable on Tuesday evening. And there was groups of 5 or 6 and the council members and the adults moved around and we talked. But the one thing that struck me was people wanted to see more police. The kids said that they're afraid to go out at night when it's dark and even in the daytime. And they're even scared in the high school. And I followed up on that and said, well, did you feel scared in grammar school, elementary school? And they said, no. I said, well, what about middle school? Well, a little bit. But it seemed like, at the high school level that there's constant fights, and some of the stuff that came up that, how easily accessible guns are and stuff like that. So it's again, we talked to 20 or 30 people, which is like 0.01% of the population of 2,000 at the school. But I just wanted to throw that out there. Go ahead, Gabrielle. I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Steve and Robert, for coming to meet with us. I see Professor Ayers is here too. Hi. So I'm just curious in your expertise, a little bit more what you think about community policing, because when I hear community policing and from what I've heard you guys say about more beats and indoctrinating police into the community, I get nervous that means that you are policing people more, and that might slowly move into like a broken windows policing type model, which there are some leaders, at least in Albany County, that have been open about encouraging that type of policing. So I'm curious, when you say that you want to include more police in the community and have more beats, how does that concept also coincide with broken windows policing and just the idea of having more police officers could mean more petty arrests?
I don't mean to speak for you, Steve, but I didn't interpret Steve to be saying that community policing would involve more officers and more beats, but rather that they would have stable assignments to individual beats so that they could become better acquainted with the people and the problems in those beat areas, and vice versa, that the people could become more familiar with the officers because they'd be potentially seeing them on a regular basis. Yes, Steve?
That's exactly right. And to go kind of a step further on that, the community-based policing was generally historically developed as actually like a strategic response to some of the problems with and perceived problems with broken windows policing, which is to say that broken windows policing was often saying, look, we're going to target even minor symptoms because disorder is what leads to these kind of like escalating crimes. And so we're going to nip this in the bud by aggressively policing even at the earliest sign of disorder, right? So community-based, and that would speak to your concerns. Community-based policing, the idea was that, well, what actually is happening is that a lot of neighborhoods and communities don't really trust a lot of police officers. And so core problems in those communities go unnoticed and undetected. And that's because the police department and its relationship to them is generally an anonymous police officer. They don't have a point of contact that has any real ties to the community. And so what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and have regularly assigned beat officers in neighborhoods so that they see them regularly, they know who they are, they know what their faces are, and that we're going to have liaisons that communities can trust to go to that aren't going to necessarily lead to, bringing down the hammer on a broken window, but are actually going to get at community identified problems. If the community is not identifying disorder as some top priority, then policing shouldn't be targeting those problems. Does that make sense and speak to your concern a little bit?
Yeah, I just, when you talk about like core problems, I can see from certain jurisdictions in the city, some people might say that a core problem is panhandlers or people that are unhoused. So I just, as we're having this conversation, I would personally, at least when we're trying to address these issues, that it's not necessarily the police department's job to address those core problems in the neighborhood, that maybe it's like a city initiative or like a government initiative. Because like I said, depending on where you are in the city, a core problem might be something that shouldn't be handled by police. And that's why I'm a public defender by trade during the day. So I see these, I see people that are annoying in their community, but are literally just unhoused or dealing with some type of drug or mental illness. So I'm throwing these things out there for this conversation. I love being a part of this, council and part of this conversation today. And I love having you guys here because you're the experts, really. So I'm curious how those concepts that I'm saying, and that's what I meant as well when you talk about community policing. It's like these pieces that are going to get criminalized. So how can we address that as well? Maybe we don't have an answer, frankly, but I would like to just interject that into the conversation because core problems are different among the city.
And they need not at all be criminalized. I think the experience in Chicago showed that police were not at the root of the solutions to problems that were addressed, and that they could coordinate with other community agencies. Some cities, some counties, some not-for-profit was essential to the success that they enjoyed in Chicago, that they could mobilize or instigate the mobilization of resources to address the problems that were priorities for neighborhood residents.
I think I knew that, Robert, but I'm so glad you said it, because when you said that before, I was like, I knew that police weren't always the answer in Chicago's case. So I would love maybe Chair Hoey, maybe we can include some more information about that type of community engagement as well when we're talking about public safety. And
yeah. And I know you jumped in late, and there was a study. Did you hear about Denver's just done a pilot, and there's just a report out, and Ava sent that to me. I'll make sure the whole committee gets, everybody who's here will get it. Well, the whole council too. Ava, I see your hand up.
Oh, if it's appropriate, just on Councilwoman Romero's point, I just wanted to say quickly that if this is consistent with what Robert and Steve think, that in terms of community policing, I know there has been significant criticism of certain aspects of community policing as a philosophy based on this concern, but it seems to me that the core ideas of community policing, as I understand them, are sort of deeper engagement between police and communities' sense of their own priorities, which is certainly consistent with, reducing policing in certain areas, depending on what they are, and this idea of having officers who are more knowable and building relationships. It seems to me that both of those are completely consistent with the idea that some kinds of response should be involving unarmed responders, that there's nothing inconsistent with the community policing philosophy about saying, yeah, but when we respond to people experiencing homelessness, that can be somebody who's a skilled outreach worker in many or even most instances, as opposed to a police officer with different training, or it could be both of them at the same time. And the same thing for like traffic stops. There's nothing about community policing, as I understand it, that says, we should have more traffic stops. We should have armed officers performing traffic stops, as opposed to using traffic cameras or reducing the number of traffic stops we do. So it seems to me that there are ways to be prioritizing community policing while also prioritizing unarmed first response for areas where it's identified as a possibility. But that's just something I wanted to offer in case it's consistent with the other professors' understanding.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I think the kind of broader goal is kind of a two-front goal of rehabilitating public trust in police, and that's going to be done through prioritizing the things that communities are identifying as problems, but also having a secondary option that is not policing. And in other words, increasing the quality of policing contacts and decreasing, in some cases, the quantity of policing contacts. And to do that is doing that through contacts with a non-police entity to connect people to services.
And that, let me get, Megan had a question, Jack, and I'll get right back to you. Megan's traveling down. She's on the highway somewhere south, I think in Virginia or something. But this is her question she wanted to throw out for you. It would be helpful to ask about police as a gateway to services. For example, those with mental health issues coming in via police are more likely to be hospitalized than those referred by licensed MH providers, medical health providers. I don't know what the MH stands for, but can you speak about that at all? Is what you wanted to know?
I would not purport to be expert on that.
So I'm not an expert on that. So I'm going to caveat but that's one thing that the Denver study was kind of speaking to ultimately, was saying, what happens with interactions with the law and with interactions with the government when we are assigning people to have a first contact, not with police, but with mental health providers and things like that. So, and I would say that the evidence on this is mostly going to be descriptive. There's not a lot of causal studies out there, which is why, the Denver study was such an interesting study. It's one of the first to try and get at this causally.
Yeah, and just as a footnote, I'd say if there's a difference, it might stem from differences in the kinds of situations that the two different responders handle. And, I saw that Denver study this morning. I think it's important to mention that they found a reduction in recorded crime, right, which is not to say they found a reduction in crime.
Right, that's fair.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, just if I could add really briefly.
Sure.
I think it's a great question. I think part of, and which I think you all heard from police officers too, is, there is training to help people connect to services. That's something, and certainly police officers can get training, and social workers are trained extensively in that. And, part of the issue is, I like what Steve said about, it's about the quality of the interactions and, what do we make sure police officers responding that they're de-escalating and referring to services rather than, using force before it's necessary. But I also think along with the service question, which is really important, there's just sort of a game of playing the odds to avoid high profile violent incidents that are going to sort of make the newspapers and permanently damage community. We seem to have one of these in Albany every 6 months to a year, whether it's violence or racism or some other sort of outbreak. And, again, I'm not a empiricist, but I know according to the Vera Institute, of the 6,000 people who've been shot by police since 2015, close to a quarter were experiencing mental health crisis. So mental health crisis response is a very significant component of police shootings. And sort of so part of the effort is not just to get people to better services, but also to, just by reducing those interactions, reduce the odds of a shooting or another sort of violent interaction. I think those are both really important goals.
I do just want to add, like, building on that a little bit, is that, some of this is when you have police acting as the centralized repository for responding to such a wide array of situations, you're also increasing the probability that a police officer's decision making is going to deteriorate over time, because they're responding to so many more varied situations. And so at least some of this, you can imagine, for instance, a situation in assignment to, say, hospitals, where that's the path of least resistance. It's a lot less work and a lot easier to simply refer somebody to a hospital. And if I have 5 other calls of varying difficulty that I'm about to be responding to or have responded to already, that's the path that I might opt for, just to manage my caseload, the sheer volume of cases that are coming my way. Cases being, calls for service, etc.
Jack, you had your.
I guess my question has to do with armed police and unarmed. I wonder if there's any data, any municipalities or countries that can show that crime rates are down, or low level crimes are down, or any type of data that will say to us as a city, it's the way to go, because we have data to prove it.
I mean, some of the problem with that is that it's a fairly new.
Well, that's what I said. It is new, so that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, right. So San Francisco, Eugene, Oregon, Denver. There's only been a handful of cities over the past 5 years or so that have even developed pilot programs that do this sort of thing. Some of them pair unarmed first responders with police officers. Some of them have them entirely separately to different categories of calls for service. But my understanding is that the data that's going to be available is somewhat limited by lack of implementation broadly. Robert, you might have a different understanding.
I'm not sure I have really anything meaningful to add. I mentioned that during the whole reform and reinvention process, I think it was probably the very end of 2020 or early 2021, the Schenectady County Communications Center took it upon itself to develop a protocol whereby some calls for service that previously would have involved a dispatch of a police officer instead involved dispatch of people from Northern Rivers. And I wish I could say that I'd followed how that went and where they stand now, and even collected data on the outcomes of those calls. I haven't, but they, as I understand it, modeled that after a program in Broome County. And we learned a little bit about the way that operates. They too divert some calls entirely from the police dispatch queue. And so far from what I'm told, I haven't seen any systematic evaluation of it, but with good success.
That's something we can follow through on, definitely, especially the Schenectady. And that was the county you said, Robert?
Yeah. They took it very slowly, which I think is the way to do it. They tried it out with calls that they thought they could safely divert from the police queue. I don't know how much, if at all, they've expanded it since then, but that was my understanding of how Cahoots operated and developed in Eugene, Oregon. That they started small and experimented with how they could expand to other call categories. And I think that's a safe way to go, so that you can minimize the errors in dispatch.
I would second that, especially in light of, all it takes is one thing going extremely wrong early on in implementation, and you could undermine the political support for this. So, as I'm sure everybody's sensitive to.
As we all know, UK is unarmed. So my question is, maybe, is there data from UK that shows it's a good way? I mean, I assume it is, because they use it, and that's big major stories.
Yeah, that's a tough comparison to draw, though, because they also have much fewer armed citizens. than
Okay.
we have here, right? So like the context of calls for service is just wildly different. So.
Gabriella?
Thank you. Jack, I'm not sure. I want to clarify your question. When you say unarmed responders lead to less crime, do you mean unarmed responders leading to more social contact referrals for like mental health and drug use? Or do you mean more unarmed responders lead to less arrests? Because I don't think that we can find a connection between unarmed responders and less crime, because that's not, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like unarmed police aren't going to reduce crime. It's more, are they increasing the social contact referrals, or are they arresting people less?
No, I agree. I was just wondering if there's any data on unarmed officers responding.
With more social contact referrals?
Right, yes.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think we have that data from the Accord program with Matt Peter. The county, for those that don't know, the county is working on the Accord program, which is unarmed responders explicitly responding to mental health or drug-related calls. And Chair Hoey, that might be a good idea to have Matt kind of tell us more about the success of that program, because I pester him consistently about bringing that to the city of Albany, because right now it's just being piloted in the hill towns. But I just want, for Jack's question, because I bet Steve and Robert, we're going to call you guys back in, and Professor Ayers as well, we're going to call you all back in to kind of give us more information later. And I'm curious if you guys would, just to clarify Jack's prompt about unarmed responders leading to less arrests or more referrals, not necessarily reducing crime, because the terminology is very important when we ask that question. So I would love to see the data if we have it, but I think we can also bring the Accord people in, hopefully, once we have that data too.
And Ava just sent me a text. She had to leave to pick up her child. So, but I appreciate that we had her. I want to just, one thing I want to hit upon, because we were talking about community policing, and one of the problems that I see, and again, I'm just a lay person and a member of the council, was, over the last couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years, we definitely saw a decrease in the amount of police personnel. That I think it reached as high as 100 out of a 350 force. And what suffered was the community policing and the community engagement unit, which shrunk down to 2 people. So, trying to figure out, what's going on now. They had a graduation yesterday. We graduated 26 new recruits. One of the things that they tried, or trying, is they went out to each ward, the new recruits, and drove around with community activists or, the ward, the council members, because I took the council, on the 15th ward, I took the officers around and showed them my neighborhood and dead end streets and stuff like that, and try to get as much information out there that I could. So we're trying, the police department is trying to get back into, full staffing and maybe new ways. And, but we definitely, as a council, we have to respond to the collaborative. And that's the hard nut in the room to crack. But I'm going to shut up at that point and give it to Ginny. Go ahead, Ginny.
Thanks, Sam. And I'm sorry for dropping out for a little bit. I had a kid thing too. But I think that's a really important point that you bring up, that I just want to kind of, I feel like it's really important as we go through this process to not necessarily be reactive to some of the things that have happened, specifically within our police force, because it has been so understaffed for so long, but instead go through an actual process on what we would like policing to look like. And not to say that we shouldn't learn from a lot of the things that have happened, but more to kind of because a lot of the conversations that we've had over the years is like, oh, we're understaffed by 70 police officers. And it's a legitimate excuse for a lot of different pieces, especially when we're talking about community policing. But when we're kind of looking at the goals of what we want our police force to look like, and one of them, from my perspective, which is, I think, kind of a separate thing, but I've never been able to figure out how we've gotten to that staffing number. So we're supposed to have 350 police, but I have no idea why we have that number. I don't know. Should it be higher? Should it be lower? Maybe we haven't been understaffed. Maybe we are even more significantly understaffed. So I think that there's a lot of questions when it comes to the actual nuts and bolts of policing within the city of Albany that's important. But I also think that when we're dealing with this overall vision of what we would like policing to look like within the city, coming at it from an intellectual side, which is, I so appreciate everybody being here. And I think that learning from the collaborative too is an important piece, because that was a very in-depth process that was really important for our community to go through, but also to learn from. So I wanted to say that because I feel like so often we just talk about the staffing and then we're done. And in this situation, we're actually talking about a vision for what we would like safety and policing to look like within our city. And I think we have to separate from that. So I just wanted to kind of tag on that and appreciate that you brought that up, because I think it's important.
Thanks, Ginny. And we're joined by committee member Alfredo Ballerin. There's John Raphael. I know you did a lot of the work on the legislation. And what really has me, the one thing I'm going to take away from tonight, it might be the answer, is the pilot program in Denver. Is that something that we could develop, a pilot program? I'm just trying to figure out how they did. I have to read the study, of course, but if you hire people and then the pilot program doesn't work, what happens to those people? It's just a lot, but I'm just going to throw that out at you, JR. What do you think?
I'm out here saying that I'm actually not too familiar with the Denver program at this time. I haven't had time to review it.
Okay, and again, I was just thinking about if we had to write legislation, what it would look like and stuff. But we can go to Denver and look at what they passed and how they did it exactly. I don't know, Sonia or Kelly. I don't know which meeting you're on, but do you have anything to say or bring up? They might be on the violence task force.
Chair, I think you're muted.
Megan, you have your hand up. I see it. Go ahead.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I'm back in good reception. So, we do have an opportunity coming down the pike, as Gabriella mentioned before, to implement the board program, which is very, very close to the model that was in operation in Denver. It is also very close to some other similarly situated programs in which there are unarmed responders sent out to deal with certain things. However, I would also kind of note that in the way that local law C is structured, and from the conversations that we've been having, my understanding was that, at least in how this bill is crafted, that we would have an appointed body that would then sort of make these decisions after we pass this legislation. We then have to appoint that body, and they then have to make the determination as to what policy recommendations they're making back to us in the administration. So I think that is also something that y'all need to think about in sort of what your strategy or what our ultimate strategy is going to be in terms of implementation for this. Then my only other point, and I know Ava sort of had to run out of the meeting, is that there is a pretty decent list of things that they're talking about giving to these unarmed responders that is sort of above and beyond the types of responsibilities that are typically given for just substance abuse and what we'd refer to as sort of the third person calls. And many of those things on that list are things that you really cannot, you cannot have a civilian necessarily do. It would have to be a sworn person, at least in the way that New York state law is currently structured around those issues. So that is also something that I think needs to be processed through. And then I think that the last point that I would make, because it was brought up quite a bit today, is, you know, the conversation around what we do with our vehicle traffic law cases. We don't function, as far as I know, in the Albany Police Department, and I think this is something that we really should, some of the critical questions that we should be asking the department. Unlike our suburban departments, we really don't have just a quote unquote traffic detail, right? Like, we're so busy that we don't have people just sitting around waiting to write speeding tickets. And I think we need to look at the data in terms of the overall safety that is specific to Albany, because when you start to look at officers involved in regular, you know, vehicle and traffic related activities are more often than not ultimately recovering things like drugs and handguns from those vehicles. So I think that that is something that certainly needs to be thought about and considered. If you're talking about moving things like, you know, traffic control to an unarmed force, if that makes any sense to y'all. And then I'll mute myself. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to let you know, there was a traffic division, but like with the shortage, they pretty much did away with it. The chief had told us, I think last year, and Jenny can correct me if I'm wrong, that they were going to try to redo it again. But I want to go back to your original statement about local law CNF. Local law CNF are, you know, we're still working on it. Just what's out there right now is a placeholder. It's not definite. And Corey, I've talked to Corey, I've talked to Dirk. You know, we can work on this and come up with the best thing that's needed for the city. So it's not set in stone. This is, we can do amendments, we can rethink it. I'm really excited about the Denver study, about the Accord program. This is stuff that we really need to look at. I'd like to do, instead of just jumping in head first, let's try to do a pilot maybe and see how this thing would work out. But that's just my opinion. And, you know, we do have a committee. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, Accord is responding to stuff countywide at this point. They're not just doing that rural section of Albany County, as far as I know. And we already have folks from the fire department on that paramedic detail for the Accord program, in addition to whatever they're doing. So just so that you know, and the county is getting ready to release its Tier 1 data on that. And the one reason why I bring up Accord is because there's the potential for the city to not have to shoulder the burden of financing that program on its own if we utilize those county resources, because the county would provide us with the mental health side of that program. We would just be responsible for the paramedic side of that program. So it's just, in terms of sustainability for something like this, I think it's something we need to consider, rather than creating a whole new model that's going to be operating in tandem with something that the county's already doing. That's all.
That's a great point that you're bringing up, that you know, they're already running with this. You know, why reinvent the wheel? I mean, I could see a problem with this. They have their own dispatch. We have dispatch, but I'm sure we could work something out. And it's a good point that you brought up, and thank you for bringing it up. It's something we need to look at. Go ahead, Jenny.
Wasn't your dispatch supposed to be combined?
It hasn't happened. They were talking about it, but there was a lot of
It
problems.
was like a definite plan. We actually budgeted, we changed our budget as a result of it on dispatch.
What was that, 2 or 3 years ago, Jenny?
Yeah, yeah.
It
And
fell
I
through.
don't-
What happened
so
was the
It
retirement.
was,
It was the people's, they wouldn't get, the Albany City dispatchers would not get credit for all the time they put in. So if somebody worked 20
Oh.
years, they'd be starting from the beginning. So now you got to deal with
That's
the
not fair.
union, which it's not right. I
that's
mean,
not fair. Yeah,
yeah,
no, no.
yeah. So
And I fully 110% support our people, but I do know that that was something that, I mean, we actually changed our budget as a result of it. So I'm assuming we changed it back when we knew that that wasn't happening, but
I don't know.
just in terms of overlap of services, which is, I have to say, when we're dealing with any city service, and especially with police, if we're looking at streamlining things, then that might be something that's worth going back into, because if we want to replicate the Accord program, then it might make sense to kind of do this overlap of services and actually start to really overlap a lot more and figure out the best practices for that. But clearly, we need to make sure that our people are taken care of. So,
And we could do cross training too. I mean, to me, the dispatcher becomes the number one responder, because they got to determine, is this an armed response or an unarmed response? And one thing we never talked about, and unfortunately, I've gone through it, where somebody dies, the police will come and they hang out till the coroner or whoever comes. I mean, does somebody need to be armed for something like that? Unless, if it was just a normal death. But again, there's a lot of functionality.
probably depends on the situation.
Yeah, well, yeah, if somebody shot you, oh boy.
I'm just guessing because I have no experience with it,
Yeah.
fortunately.
All right. It hit 6:30. We're about an hour. Does Sonia, I see you jumped in. Do you have it? We had some really good conversations here, and you can go back. It's taped,
Yeah.
thank God. And but do you have any thoughts or anything you'd like to bring up with the folks?
No, I'm gonna likely I'll be watching this back tonight. I was more violence prevention was asking some questions, so was a little in tune there. But thank you.
Okay, well, if nobody has anything further, Robert and Steve, I can't thank you enough. I love intellectual stuff, and again, my biggest fear is to do something that would cause more harm than good. I think doing a pilot program is, you brought up about Denver, and we got a copy of that program. We'll definitely look at it, and working with the county, and I want to reach out to Schenectady and see what's going on out there. So there's a lot of homework that we got to do. I'm hoping that we could get you back at some point, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you so much. I mean, both of you. I know there's a few other people I invited, but maybe they couldn't make it for different reasons. So maybe we'll try to do it again. So if nobody else has anything or questions, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
All right. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Have a great night. Thank you again.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.